And I felt that I needed to read everything he'd ever written, everything Levinas had ever written, everything Lacan had ever written, Freud, Kierkegaard.
If there's one philosopher who's all of whom's work I do not want to read, it's Levinas.
Yeah,
Levinas.
I just find
Just
it
the
so
most tortured.
Yeah, like drawn out and like I don't know, maybe
soy.
Yeah, self-indulgent or something.
I mean, it's. I think it's just because it's the exact opposite philosophy that we would like to be engaging with. At one time, I was quite taken by it, but
Same.
it's, what I found to be one of the most scathing parts of the essay was when Žižek is talking about that. Yes, of course, Levinas's philosophy is meant to be written about the Shoah, meant to account for the Shoah, but he says that it's suspiciously the account of someone who watched the Shoah from a safe distance. And it's like, jeez. I mean, because Žižek's whole retort is the Musliman, right? Which is the sort of universal Musliman, the person, the subject who doesn't have a face, who doesn't look back.
Yeah.
And Levinas is like kind of stuck on the pre-Shoah concept of humanity. It's pretty intense to fucking claim that, but like, why not? I mean, why
not? If those are the terms of the debates, you know.
Yeah. Hey, it's the philosophy of someone who observed the Shoah. It's intense. Yeah.
I'm a bit, and like just in terms of reading Levinas, I'm just reminded, in a very stark way of like the philosophy that we were educated with in university. And it's
very much so.
And it just makes it very clear, like what we were immersed in then, what we're interested in now.
It's kind of a trigger. You read like one paragraph,
like
what Žižek's included, and you're like, ooh, no. All the aporias and fucking shit. You're like,
it's like
looking at the unlookable.
You really have to say always already again. Like you just said it, man.
Seeing the unseeable, making possible the impossible. It's just like all the aporias abound.
Conditions of impossibility.
I feel like I'm ordering ice cream, like, I'll have a scoop of the sayable unsayable, and
it's because all the track ice cream, like the turtle tracks, the grizzly tracks.
Yeah.
They're all the same ice cream. And
it's all the trace, right?
All those terms.
It's the trace. It's the Doridian trace track. Moose track is just a Doridian trace.
So is the turtle track. They're all the same thing.
It's all about the presence of an absence. You lament in a kind of hauntological way the absence of a turtle.
But who are you to lament?
That's true. Who am I to even say anything?
Who are you to lament?
Who are you to listen? Who am I to speak?
Fucking mic drop,
That's from Peep Show.
Right.
Yeah.
You could have told me that was from Embers, or Cinders or whatever the fuck Derrida text is.
Well, before we get the ball rolling, I think that I should inform the listeners that Žižek and so on, this podcast is proud to inform you that we have opened up an embassy in the world podcasting capital, Brooklyn, New York.
Finally, we're finally hitting the streets, trying to make a name for ourselves in the podcasting apple.
I've got my press,
the city of apples
pass. I'm accosting random people on the street and asking them if they're podcasters.
All of them seem to be. And the answer is yes, affirmatively from every single person you meet in Brooklyn. Goodbye, Germany. Hello, New York.
Hello, New York.
Oh, Guten Tag. Hey, Guten Tag over here.
And also, welcome to anyone who's new. Who's new. We're Žižek and so on. We have a Patreon. I'll never get it. A Patreon. You can be a patron on our Patreon for $5 a month. We've got a pretty active Discord server and also a reading group. And we're just about to finish the Sublime Object of Ideology, and then
we're gonna do the secret next. I think it's gonna be really fun. And so I'm Peter. There's Jake. There's Will. Žižek and so on. And actually, in
Howdy-ho.
line with an American presence, I wanna also say that the spelling of neighbor is better as BOR. I don't like the Canadian BOUR, harbor, neighbor. I think it's an annoying spelling, throwing in the silent U there. What do you
I'm
guys think?
torn.
I've always spelt it the American way, even color, COLOR.
I like that one more too.
I like
don't
the
know why.
U, but not in neighbor.
Neighbor. That's I can't keep myself from thinking that whenever
Neighbor.
I read it. Neighbor.
Neighbor. We're talking about the neighbor. Heidi ho.
But if
I
it's
did a
neighbor,
ho.
I mean, if you're gonna have a problem with the U, why not take on the
EIGH.
EIG? Why
Yeah.
not just NABOR?
That's
Push
pretty
it
good.
further.
For the war.
Yeah.
So today we're doing an episode on The Neighbor, and it's a book from a book that Žižek contributed to. The Neighbor: 3 Inquiries into Political Theology, and Žižek's essay is called "Neighbors and Other Monsters: A Plea for Ethical Violence."
Okay, so maybe we should start by trying to get towards Žižek's definition of a neighbor.
Yeah, what do we think of this, Jake? You were vibing on it. Anything you want?
Well,
Any
okay.
kind of general thoughts?
I want to do I obviously want to roll through this Heideggerian style. I'm like, what do we mean when we say the neighbor, right? Like the neighbor, I think, always promotes a kind of familiarity, right? One of not only of proximity, but also of divide, perhaps over the fence, the one who lives next to you, the one who even lives below you or above you. There's a concept of proximity always built into the neighbor. Now, Žižek's essay title is leading us to believe that we're supposed to think of the neighbor in the valence of monstrosity.
Mhm.
And a plea for an ethics of violence is obviously paradoxical, right? Or at least according to our sort of structural understanding of what a neighbor actually is. It's the person to whom, you would not commit violence because they're your neighbor, right? There's a peaceful coexistence assumed in the relationship of neighborly love or of neighborly relations. You lend a fucking vacuum, you lend a fucking ladder, whatever, a cup of sugar. And obviously this, the concept of neighbor is complicated by any measure of socio-political realities, where you live, who your fucking neighbor is. But the point, I think, of this essay is to begin at the very injunction to love one's neighbor. And I think Žižek's ability to think dialectically about the neighbor has everything to do with not just a kind of retroactive reading of the Talmud, but also of the current politically correct and postmodern understanding of the other, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of where he starts with that notion of the other, the postmodern notion of like tolerance towards the other, of the other as inhabiting some sort of like fundamentally ethical ground for you in relation to you. Yeah,
exactly. That the other in some the call of the exactly. Yeah, the ethical call that is, but which is not necessarily a it's what the other is. The other is the ethical call, right? That you are ultimately, in quotes, always already responsible to the other in their radical alterity, in their otherness, and that it is their otherness that is the grounding of a kind of fundamental ethics, which is kind of prior to ontology, right? Or is simultaneous to ontology. But I think that because Žižek's coming from not only a dialectical standpoint, but one of psychoanalysis, he's able to think of the subject and how the concept of a psychoanalytic subject will confuse and problematize the postmodern sort of easy folding of the other into a immediately an ethical imperative, right? It's like, and that's not, it's not that easy.
No, it's a very great, it's a
good point, because it kind of rests on something, on like a judgment given to both the subject and the other as being kind of cohesive identities, total, and like, but the, in response, Žižek kind of asks like, how are we to claim what the other is, what the other wants, when we don't know ourselves, and vice versa? There's always a problem of both the other and of oneself, kind of like as a stumbling block on this sort of ethic.
Right, and it's like the example that Hegel uses about the ancient Egyptians, where he says that the secrets of the ancient Egyptians were secrets for the ancient Egyptians themselves. Whereas I think that a more kind of ethical view, this Levinasian ethical view of the other, would maybe say that there isn't a secret to the other than the one that you impose upon it.
Like the idea that if there is in fact a secret of the other, that the other does know it, and that by understanding the other or coming into a certain kind of measured distance to the other and a tolerant distance to the other, we can know it as well. That there's something essentially
like
that
pure in the other, right? That is
that there's something whole.
Yeah, they know, like they know who they are, and like we can in some sense learn something, not only about them but about ourselves when we interact with them.
Right.
Multiculturalism, like this is the kind of essence of multiculturalism.
Definitely, yeah. And getting back in touch with your roots, you know, trying to find an authentic relation to a past, to an ethnic lineage, or to a religious lineage. In one's roots is very much this move of like
having some
the
cohesive ability to
exactly.
Well, and I think
one
that
with your roots and at one's like in connection with other people, etc.
Which is why, I mean, ultimately the framing of this conversation about the neighbor, at least from Žižek's terms, is especially in the like aggressively postmodern, politically correct understanding that we can get to we can be our identity. We can identify with something that gives us a certain kind of like non-fallacious, very certain sense of self. For him, as of course, as always, there's something that remains of the subject, regardless of the imaginary identifications we make with not only, knowledge of self, but also knowledge of the other's desire, right? That the other's desire is something that is like something knowable, something sayable, and something easily communicated based upon our willingness to listen and their willingness to just bespeak it. And I think what's great about this essay is that Žižek he flexes dialectics. He reads the injunction originally from the Bible, which is love thy neighbor as thyself. And he also reads Levinas in a way that he shows that what's present in both of these examples is still he's able to, by reading them dialectically, show how they can produce what they missed, how they produce in their missing the importance of the in sort of misunderstanding the neighbor, and in the Talmudic sense, in sort of like problematizing love, like how do we love the neighbor as we love ourselves, and then with Levinas the concept of the face, Žižek works through those things to present ultimately at the end a different kind of ethics.
Yeah,
which
and like how would you differentiate in this context the other and the neighbor? Are they the same thing in this discussion?
It's a great question.
That's a good question. I think the neighbor is Žižek's term for the other.
Yeah, maybe it implies more of a kind of social valence.
I think the word is ethical. I think that the way that we localize the other and the neighbor, I don't think it doesn't necessarily they're both the same and not. I think that the neighbor just implies a certain kind of ethics because of its presence in the Bible.
Maybe the neighbor, in some sense, kind of returns you to yourself in this instance. Like when you were describing earlier, like the neighbor all around us. I'm thinking about. I was reading this in my room and I could hear people speaking below me. Someone speaking in room next to me. I'm in the sunroom right now. I'm looking at like all the houses and apartments near me, and it's like it kind of immerses you in a world, but a world where like the others aren't.
It's a differentiated other. It's an other that.
Well, and they don't even have to be aware of you.
It's a particular other.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's ironic, Will, and is that he's stating a universal. It's that anyone can be your neighbor.
Well,
and so it's the neighbor. It's universal.
Universal singular, right?
Singular. Yeah, the neighbor is the universal singular insofar as there are particular neighbors, but the injunction, the ethical injunction, which then, what does Hegel say? How the species,
as we've been
falls into, right? How the genus falls into the species. It's like there's the neighbor that you should love like yourself always, and then there's your fucking neighbor who's making loud noises at night or who's whatever stealing your things. But there's the universal singular here that's present, right? Is that you should
Definitely,
love your neighbor. It's the golden rule, right? It's just sort of like treat everybody as you would yourself, but also in this case, it's like love the person as you would love yourself. And I think that problematizes the particular, right? Of course.
Yeah, and he says, I think he says in Less Than Nothing that the neighbor is a fantasy. And he says in both senses of the term fantasy, he says that the neighbor is a fantasy in Christian terms as an ideal. And then the neighbor is also a fantasy object in the sense that it is a destabilizing dimension whose elementary form is envy. All that irritates us about the other, we imagine them having various forms of enjoyment that we don't have access to. They annoy us. We can hear them through walls. They disturb our peace and quiet. Yeah.
Because a neighbor is also kind of an other that you have access to in a way, in a kind of
it's always
in a kind of fractured way. Like like the other that you just see on the street. The difference is that like I can see my neighbors in their backyard right now. I can kind of see them as if they're at home. Like they don't know that I can see them, and they're kind of existing in a way that they wouldn't in kind of like the quote unquote public space.
Right. And it is interesting, like you just mentioned, you can see them in their homes and you don't know them. There is this kind of unheimlich, Freudian unheimlich dimension to it too, the unhomeliness quality
Uncanniness,
to it. Uncanny quality to it, because you see someone at home and your most intimate moments with yourself are at home, but they're still another. There's a dimension to them, this thingly dimension to them.
Yeah.
I think this is a great way of answering Peter's question, is the difference between the other and the neighbor is that just because of the implicit relationship of being one's neighbor, then it enforces an ethics, right? You like the super egoic versus this is what I think where we can move in the conversation, the difference between the law, the injunction versus the super egoic injunction to love thy neighbor is that when you're in and around your neighbor, you have this choice. Do you say hello? Do you like everyone sort of remembers moving in or having other people moving around them, right? There's this amazing kind of foreknown, well, to what extent are we going to communicate?
Yeah.
And sometimes, I'm friends with all of my neighbors and it takes time and whatever, but there is an awkward sort of, you're beholden to one another because you live in the same place or around one another. And where I think the other, it's hard to, and this is where Levinas tries to, I think, expand on the love thy neighbor, is it's hard to think of an ethics purely with the abstract big, other, capital O other, versus the neighbor is the other around you, the other that the other that.
So like Žižek
you're implied.
He starts with Levinas there and takes his kind of definition of the other and his ethic of the other, and then kind of moves it to the space of the neighbor as it relates to religion. But just before we get there, I wanted to bring this up with you because this is actually perfect for this episode. The other day, or like the beginning of this month, I saw someone moving into a house nearby that I thought I recognized. And then it wasn't until 2 days ago, I saw them walking in a park next to me. And I realized that they're a neighbor that we had growing up in, and they're now my neighbor in Toronto.
Whoa.
Yeah. And I don't know their names. They're the two sisters from like the corner
across the street.
I never knew their name, and it's like the perfect example of like this. They're like the forever neighbor. Like we were never friends with them, even though they're the same age as us. And it's like, what are the fucking odds that they would live on the same fucking street?
It's incredible, actually.
And not nearly as uncanny. But I just literally told you guys the story of I was looking for a new microphone for the show today on Facebook Marketplace. I'm scrolling through the options. One of them seems to be marginally cheaper than the others. I messaged them and the person says, yeah, you can meet me at X and Y intersection. And I live at X and Y intersection. And so does she. Now it's not going to be the regular Facebook Marketplace, you throw the fucking microphone through a car window and you throw cash at another person, you run, you don't even look at each other. This is going to be a neighborly, there's going to be, hey, where do you live? You live just up there. And you live, there's like, you know what I mean? It's complicated.
Yeah.
Immediately by the neighborship. Neighbor.
Yeah. I mean, like I mean, there's countless examples, but those are two trippy. Like it's kind of this like short circuit and like the neighbor relationship, or like how you kind of you move to a new place and you think there's some sort of like anonymity, and then
Yeah, guess again.
yeah,
I like the forever neighbor.
yeah.
Forever neighbor. Yeah.
Worked at a fucking horrible cafe called The Good Neighbor, and I hate
Oh
it.
yeah, that's why it's run.
I hate
Okay, yeah,
it.
yeah.
Well,
That's why
see,
it's ringing
Ned
bells.
Flanders is he's Homer's neighbor, but he is the complete embodiment of both of these elements of the neighbor, the obscene excess and the good Christian ideal of the neighbor, right?
Oh damn, that's a good.
I mean, Matt Groening literally, he must have read Lacan. I don't give a fuck. I don't care what anyone says.
Yeah.
It's too fucking.
Well, even like
too...
even his kind of like the one where Homer sees him on a ski hill and Ned slides up
it's like
and
nothing at all.
He was like, I'm wearing nothing at all.
Nothing
and
at
stupid,
all.
sexy Flanders. Even his kind of sexual excessiveness.
Yeah.
Stupid, sexy Flanders.
Yeah, he's like the very thing that makes him a good neighbor is also what makes him an unbearable neighbor. Like
exactly, yeah.
Right, but and also, of course, always a neighbor of comparison, right? Like Homer is constantly being re-identified in his comparison to Flanders. And same with the kids, Todd and what is it? Todd and Rod and Todd.
Rod and Todd. Maud, Rod and Todd.
Well, I think it's important. If I don't know, Peter, if the next step was this, but that going back to our episode about the superego, Žižek is clear to make a distinction between the law of the Bible, which is the commandment of the Bible, the injunction, which is to love thy neighbor like as thyself, versus the superegoic injunction of tolerance.
Yeah, the law part was hard for me to parse. Actually, I wonder if you can help me out with that, Jake. What was your sense of it?
So the I think that because Žižek is really careful to draw a distinction between the law as it appears in the Bible, which is love thy neighbor as thyself, and the postmodern superegoic injunction to tolerate one another despite our differences. Now, these are not the same thing. And what's interesting is that Žižek actually goes through Levinas to show this. But as a framework, looking at the difference between the two, what's immediately complicated in the Bible injunction, the commandment to love thy neighbor as thyself, is, first off, the way Žižek understands love, and this is from Freud, is that love is radically choosing, almost violently singling out one being against the backdrop of all other beings, right? Making a contingent being absolutely necessary through love. And how could you do that with your neighbor? How could one love their neighbor in the way that Žižek and Freud understand love? Is how do we understand like the word love? And of course, there's probably libraries written on, the Talmudic interpretation of that. But I wonder if by saying that loving one's neighbor is de facto impossible, what is Žižek allowed to do? So not only is love impossible, but to love the neighbor as, you love yourself is, well, who am I, right? If anything, the neighbor poses the question, hystericizes us with their desire. Who am I? I'm the neighbor.
Yeah, because you're the neighbor to the neighbor.
I'm the neighbor, but we're both neighbors, right? I don't know if that's
no.
Besides
I'm the neighbor.
But loving oneself, this is also a problem, right? To love the neighbor as you love yourself. Well, that would assume that you could do such a thing and that there is a solid total self. So this goes back into, if you allow me one more kind of further deviation or demarcation here, is that it made me think of the mirror stage and how the imaginary obviously plays in between not only our relation to self, but also our fantastical, or phantasmatic relation to the other, which is that in the mirror, we see something that is whole. It's a false continuity, but we recognize and identify with the wholeness that we see, despite the fractured and void of subjectivity anyway. Now and we love ourselves as such, right? We're actually, the baby is described by Lacan as being like totally thrilled by this idea. And it makes me think of the way that we encounter the other, and especially the neighbor, one who is whole, or one who is total, one who we could even love, right? Like this is, but so why Žižek is able to sort of problematize love thy neighbor, or love thy neighbor as thyself, but also reinstate it, is because this is an injunction from on high. This is that automatically God or whatever, I want to say that this relationship is deemed impossible. So the law becomes necessary because it is an impossible relationship.
So
it's
like
supposed to inform what is
God sustains the love that one has of their neighbor.
more like it's not something that is organically understood, such as tolerance, right? Tolerance is supposed to be something that we can always or already sort of organically mobilize. But love thy neighbor as thyself is it's impossible. And it's meant, so it's not a superegoic impossibility where there's guilt. It's a fucking instantiation that you either do or you don't. Whereas the superegoic injunction of tolerance is I think much more convoluted.
And actually does,
because
like,
it speaks to,
and it runs contrary
it's
to the logic of
possible.
love. You can't love if you're being tolerant of everyone, because it
No,
levels
exactly.
everyone to the same order of being, and like love is an exception to the others whom you do not love.
Right.
Point.
But so in that sense, there is a kind of impossibility. But I think maybe what you mean in terms of the love your neighbor as yourself, it's like what comes to mind is the very present formulation. How can you love someone else if you can't love yourself? One, I think that runs entirely contrary to the logic of love that Žižek delineates, but also like makes way for its opposite. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, like loving your neighbor as yourself. You can't love your neighbor as yourself because there's an absence in your ability to love yourself and your neighbor. Like you can't entirely treat the neighbor as yourself. That is literally impossible.
Of course, there's a very important gap.
Yeah.
And but
because
ultimately
the
that gap is
within yourself as in your own subjectivity as well. Yeah.
And represented very much by the neighbor, right? And this is why I think the importance of the imaginary is so crucial here, because in one's relationship to oneself, the ideal ego, and also in one's relationship to the other, there's fantasy, right? There's this fantasy construction of totalness, of wholeness, of completeness, where ultimately what lurks behind that is the real, right? Is the real of both the subject and the other, which of course through the various identities of the other that, and differentiations that we tolerate, that still lurks.
Right?
Yeah,
so for Žižek, the other unites the three dimensions: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And it's like the Borromean knot that he talks so often about.
Right.
It's kind of simultaneously all three, and is the problem of the relationship between all three.
Yeah.
He's also trying to dispense, which he does frequently, with the idea that there is an inner wealth to someone that is their true nature. Both
and including
in
yourself,
including yourself. This notion that we have an intimate relation to our inner selves, our inner wealth of being, and tolerance means allowing for that inner being of the other on a global, universal scale or political scale,
and as if it's knowable, right, and communicable. Yeah. As if we could know it, right? I mean, this is like, as he says, this is why it's so great that he brings Levinas in, because I think this reminds me of capitalism with the human face. It's like, the capitalist believes, he goes home and he pets his cats and maybe he reads Melville, but he goes to work on Wall Street every day. And he believes that there's a fucking, there's a wealth behind him.
Yes,
that's truly who he is.
Yeah.
But Žižek says, ultimately the true self, the wealth, the wealth of our inner world is the true illusion which allows us to participate in the sort of evils that we do. Yeah, and so, please tell me more about the things that you know about yourself. But ultimately, in a very psychoanalytic way, it's like, well, what's being covered over in any kind of statement of or clarification of self, right? And this is the truth about the other as much as it's the truth about the subject. What any identification stems from is a radical negative void, and we only become, I think, endangered or threatened by that void when we're in a neighborly proximity to the other, right?
Yeah. And so, in relation to what Žižek is saying about Levinas's point about the face, right? You'll see at the beginning of a lot of Levinasian type texts. I'm thinking of another French philosopher named Le Coulebart. I remember opening up one of his books And the first sentence was something like, I probably mentioned this before on the podcast, something like, who am I to speak?
Or who am I to speak? Who are you to listen?
What possible justification do I have to be writing this text? And I promptly closed the book because I feel like you should know if you're going to write a book. But anyway, the Žižek answer to that, he says, should the answer not be to an assertion of my right to exist in harmony with and tolerance of others be a much more radical claim? Do I exist in the first place? Am I not rather a whole in the order of being? To assume basically the hysterical position, right?
Yeah, and to that, and kind of, I think, summing up what we're talking about right now, he has a quote that I sent you guys earlier. It got me jazzed up, but he writes, Lacan's position is thus not a being exposed or overwhelmed, caught in a cobweb of pre-existing conditions, is not incompatible with radical autonomy. Of course, I cannot undo the substantial weight of the context in which I am thrown. Of course, I cannot penetrate the opaque background of my being. What I can do in an act of negativity is cleanse my palate, draw a line, exempt myself, step out of the symbolic in a suicidal gesture of a radical act, what Freud called death drive, what a German idealism called radical negativity.
Right. And so this, just before we go back into Levinas, we got to go further back into the love thy neighbor as thyself. What Žižek says is what's crucial about this is the link between the impenetrability of the other and my own impenetrability to myself. They're linked, right?
Yeah.
Because my own being is grounded in this relationship, in this exposure to the other as something unknowable, and that which is linked ultimately to my
true
unknowability.
link. Yeah, the true link is the negativity between you, not the kind of positively given attributes and
not some fucking
the overlapping
exactly some
of lacks.
Positive contents, right? Like, and I think that the thing with that tolerance does is either it's all about, the concept of that we can know the other. It's like, once you hear their story, Žižek always goes like, the enemy, right? The enemy is just the person we haven't heard their story. He obviously rails against this, but it's like the idea that if you go on long enough, I'll probably find something that makes us neighborly. Oh shit, you also like this, that, and the other thing. Or you just, basically you live next to me. That's also a commonality, but same social class, et cetera, that false positive content does nothing but obscure that original terrifying link, which is ultimately about finitude, right? Which is ultimately about, the void, about the nothing that's at the center of any of those positive fucking iterations, enunciations. And I think that of course, an ethics that begins with the positive contents, as opposed to the ontological or psychoanalytic understanding of, and by ontological I mean dialectical understanding of the void, then you get an ethics that's like, bound to fail.
Yeah,
because,
it's an ethics
because who is your brother? Who is your neighbor?
Right? And there is a relation between this tolerant attitude and, I would say, to go way to the extreme, a fascistic notion of authentic being, right? A blood and soil mentality. They're linked.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And another distinction to be drawn is something that some nameless person on Twitter who I saw, who said that rather than authenticity, we should emphasize autonomy. And Peter, in that quote you read, I think he used that word, or even if he didn't, I think the point was there that autonomy being this minimal space of negativity.
Mm.
Versus a constructed historical ground or political social grounding of a fantasy that attempts to suture over the negativity of the social order or of subjectivity itself.
Yeah, and it's super important to emphasize the historical, right? Because that's the materials perspective. There is like, well, what, the historical answer to who are you? That, of course, the hysterical question, why am I what I am for you, or what you say I am, is purely, for the most part, you cannot answer in a way that is proper to the void, right? You can only come up with ways that are, I think, ultimately determined to be historical, material, constructed, etc., based on essentially the coordinates of ideology and the dominating symbolic order, right? Organization of the symbolic order.
And it's
Sorry,
also,
Pete, I interrupted.
No, not at all. And also, I think this kind of reminds me of the toilet episode that we did, of like each place you're in, each country you're in, has a kind of a different relationship with neighbors. there is something heavily culturally informed by the way we interact with our neighbors. And even this is the way we refer to like within our own culture. It's like, oh, people used to know their neighbors' names. And isn't it sad that we don't know that anymore? It kind of denotes crumbling societal norms, etc. Whereas like I just think that rather than that necessarily saying something cohesive about ideology at the moment, rather the differences between how we experience those neighborly interactions kind of say more.
That's brilliant. It's brilliant because I mean, even in passing there, you said societal norms, and I think that that's the way we understand neighborly conduct, right? Is, and I don't mean social mores or manners per se, but ultimately a kind of traditional always nostalgic sense of what it is to be around one another. And Žižek's like, no, in fact, what we're actually getting at is the problem of the neighbor, not some kind of assumed positive, consistent relationship that you can count on regardless of who your neighbor is. No, sometimes you're in a different place. Sometimes your neighbor is somebody you don't know, etc. You know, the positive content can change, but the whole point of the biblical injunction to love thy neighbor as thyself is to focus on the very impossibility of that relationship. As Peter, as you said, the founding of our ethical status, which is not based on who we are, but based on autonomy, on a radical 0 point of the subject. Not, you know, you're black, you're white, you're this, you're that. It's more about the subject.
And you know what I'm reminded of is like what Žižek says about politeness as a way of counteracting, like, and I think this has a lot to do with the neighbor. Like, rather than us knowing the neighbor as we know ourselves, which, you know, as we've been discussing, is impossible. A polite attitude towards your neighbor is one that doesn't necessitate any sort of like so-called authentic connection between you two. It's more about the abstract, the universal, the giving way to those societal norms as a way of like keeping each other at a distance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's what Žižek says is you remember his description of living in New York City. He lived in this apartment building where, you know, next door to him lived some guy from Japan, and then the other side was, you know, a guy from, I don't know, Turkey or something, and they all completely ignored each other. And Žižek thinks that this is the ideal world.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So just to finish up this point, then maybe we go into I love that the section of Žižek's fucking essay that's dedicated to Levinas is called "Smashing the Neighbor's Face," which, but, you know, by the way, like, talk about suggesting a signifier. You know, I think that, like, really the closeness of the neighbor always presents a certain kind of either a kind of perversion, a kind of violence, a kind of surveillance, a kind of unasked for knowledge. You know, it's not all fun and games with the neighbor. You know, there's something quite erotic and perhaps, you know, obviously this will maybe lead into a conversation of how the neighbor relates to desire as such. But it's like smashing the neighbor's face. Like, what an incredible fucking, like, Levinas writes about the face as the origin of human ethics. Mm-hmm. And we have a title here, smashing,
pre-ontological.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and this is what
ethical before the ontological,
which I remember when I read that back in university, I actually thought there was some incredible credence to that, you know, in terms of like a Heideggerian sense of being with. But I think that that Žižek wants to draw out here is that the presence of the other does not in any way guarantee that the relationship will be one of ethics per se. It is one of violence. And why? And I think Levinas actually does at one point, I can't really remember in my readings, but he does talk about how the question is who's going to kill whom. And that the whole point of a kind of facilitating or what's presented to us in the face is ultimately the vulnerability of the other. And am I going to die or are you going to die is this sort of primordial ethical question when confronted with the face of the other. But what Žižek, what he cements this in, or what he anchors this in, is the understanding that the law from on high, love thy neighbor as thyself, is of a more fundamental violence, right? That of encountering the other, where there needs to be a minimal fucking space or regulation put and placed onto a very impossible, stressful relationship, not to someone who just looks like you, who fucking resembles you, but the neighbor qua like this fucking traumatic thing, right? This like, I mean, das Ding, right?
What Levinas is saying is that, you know, in the experience of the other's face, that kind of is the problem on which it reflects like ethics back to yourself, and then how you treat others, etc. And I think what Žižek's response is that kind of interaction is already needs to be mediated by what he believes Levinas is not acknowledging, which is the big other. Like that relationship is ultimately sustained by the big other, like as the kind of imaginary arbiter of this relationship.
He had a great formulation on that note. Žižek says, a positive living being occupying a determinate space in reality, rooted in it, is by definition a moment of its circulation and reproduction.
Loved it.
So rather than the face being this pre-ontological, image held in, you know, like this.
Demand. A demand.
Right. Yeah. Pre-ontological demand. It is, Žižek is sort of putting it into the structure of the symbolic as a site, in its Hegelian way, actually, as a site, a moment of its circulation and reproduction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as a result of it, yeah.
He says that, you know, the coincidence of the three dimensions of the Borromean knot, the imaginary, the symbolic, the real, the coincidence of that knot being linked or tied in the neighbor means that it signals that there's something monstrous about the neighbor behind the very sort of seamless linking of the three. Lacan says that the capital O other, or the, you know, in this case, we'll talk about it in terms of the neighbor, suggests a certain kind of madness that's akin to the madness of symbolic representation itself, right? Mm-hmm. That the speech act emerges from the fact, like that the symbolic order itself is kind of insane, kind of crazy, but it mediates the impossible relationship. It's our only way of facilitating the impossible relationship with a person with whom there's no possibility of reciprocal exchange.
Are you like, I'm not sure if this came up, but obviously what comes to mind is the Hegelian master-slave dialectic as the experience of otherness. But maybe like what we would add in merely it being like one person passes another in the street is that as with the master-slave dialectic, the tension there is the dialectic with like back and forth.
Right. Or rather the relationship is the dialectical, right? Or rather the relationship is dialectical. I wanted to go back and clarify like what I mean when I say like the mediation is necessary for this impossible relationship. It's that the symbolic order emerges out of its own lack in order to and then obscures that lack. Mm-hmm. Just the same as the relationship, which is demanded from on high, sort of obscures. It's the relationship that needs to be diffused through the symbolic order. It obscures the very impossibility of that relationship, but emerges the law to love thy neighbor as thyself emerges out of the impossibility to even do so, right? Mm-hmm. The abyss of the circularity there.
Right. Whereas if it's just a face, it's like Levinas is trying to say there's nothing before that. And whereas like in your description, the face is the kind of like already symbolized lack.
Yeah.
Exactly. So Levinas is saying the ethical call precedes every encounter with the other and their face, but from Žižek's point of view, that's absurd.
He's saying that like that you could conceive of Levinas's position as being exactly what Žižek is saying about this possession with, or this takenness with the idea that of an inner wealth of subjectivity.
Mm-hmm. That the ethic.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, that the ethical call would emerge from the face, and not the thing behind it, right? Because as Žižek says, like famously, the face is the ultimate mask. It's the face is the ultimate fetish object, right?
Yeah.
That we would assume that in the other's face is all of them ontologically and ontically present to me, demanding an ethical call. But ultimately, what's lacking in the other that not only requires me to hystericize myself, but it's also the object cause of my desire, right? Like it's the thing that disturbs me and propels the death drive.
And
right?
that otherness that precedes or exceeds the face, is excessive to the face, is revealed for Žižek and Lacan in the face for a grimace, when the face
A
kind
tick.
of like grimaces, it kind of breaks the mold of merely being a face and kind of like points to a further or less graspable otherness.
Yes, an excess maybe would be
Yeah.
the term for sure. An excessive otherness, right?
Yeah, actually, just to bring it very very specifically back to the room I'm in right now. I see my neighbors in their backyard all the time. You know, they're in the back, they're in the sun, having a drink, and I thought that they lived in this kind of like redone garage area in the back, but I just saw them open the door, and I could see the street on the other side of it. So like what I thought was like where they dwelled, like they opened the door and there's actually nothing there, and I realized now they actually live in the house next door to me.
That's fine.
Reminds me of like the Acme doors, like in like Roadrunner or whatever. Like they open the door and there's like a fucking train behind it or whatever, you know. Or
I was like, I thought there was a house in there.
It is also interesting, as Žižek points out, the in the psychoanalytic in the fuck, what's it called, where an analyst does their shit, clinic. In the clinical situation, what is the relationship of the faces, the analyst and the analyst end? They don't look at each other.
They're not
The
looking at
analyst
each other.
end faces away from the analyst. And Žižek says, we can clearly see now how far psychoanalysis is from any defense of the dignity of the human face. Is the psychoanalytic treatment not the experience of rendering public to the analyst who stands for the big other one's most intimate fantasies, and thus the experience of losing one's face in the most radical sense of the term?
That's amazing. It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah, because there's
it's
something
all about taking off. A bit like you said, Jake, the face is a mask. You know,
it's so unfortunate, right? To wear it, because you on some level you're constantly anchored symbolically by the way that you are represented, which of course betrays a certain kind of identifiability, both to yourself in the mirror and then to other people around you. But it also doesn't do any. I don't think it's actually the footnote or the reference to the radical negativity that is your subject. You know, that is subjectivity.
It just
what is a body?
Well, I just wonder, like,
partial object, man.
Yeah, I just wonder.
Partial object.
Trying to think about this in relation to Hegel's idea that the truth is in the appearance. So if Žižek is saying that the mask is some kind of fake or something, maybe actually what his point would be is that our presumption that the face entails an authentic
deeper
relation.
Meaning, yeah.
Rather, you can see in the very appearance, the appearance of the face could actually actively negate that presumption, because everyone has a face, and even bad, evil people have faces. Hitler had a face. Was there just an authentic relation missed with a lack of confrontation with Hitler's face? You see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Well, I find the idea that it's
like, obviously Levinas doesn't mean people's actual, like, he doesn't mean, you know, like Jake's face. Is more
kind of,
or does he?
Like,
he does.
I think
does he? Like,
well,
Jake's like
my
face.
goddamn fucking face. Yeah, your face and my face. But and that there's actually both Levinas, I think, also tries to claim, by making it the origin of a kind of ethical relationship, that it's both universal singular, right? Is that like Will's face and my face still function as the portal to, right?
And of
ethics.
course,
but
I think what Levinas is intentionally doing, and what Žižek is describing him as doing, is it's connecting with the Jewish notion of the law, and of the law as being beyond
the face. It's a face beyond the face. So his response is, prior to encountering the other, this I'm quoting him directly, prior to encountering the other as a face in front of us, Peter's face, Will's face, the other is here as a paradoxical background face. In other words, the first relationship to another is that to a faceless third, and that third is the law. And because what Žižek thinks is that justice is emphatically not justice for the motherfucking neighbor or their goddamn face. The true ethical step for Žižek is the one that goes beyond the face of the other in front of you, the one of kind of, the face suspended in front of us. But it's the ethics for Žižek is choosing against that face in front of us and choosing the law instead. A kind of cold, calculated, regardless of the content of the face in front of you, you act in a moral way that's in line with the impossible logic of the law.
The passage, perhaps then, like this indicates this passage from Judaism to Christianity, and like we could understand the law, the ethics of the face versus this more kind of Lacanian notion towards what Žižek understands to be the Christian law and the Christian notion of the neighbor.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of where he leaves me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did he? What was the last sentence that Christianity is Judaism?
Yeah,
we'll get to that maybe, but
I think we're kind of there. We can get there. I think we kind of land a ship, but then wax poetic a little bit.
Okay,
right. I was thinking that, like, I think it's obviously very important. So maybe getting to this Christianity is Judaism thing at the end. Like, Žižek is obviously thinking of ethics in terms of universality, right? I mean, I don't know if that clarifies things, but it's like
I think
that does clarify. Yeah,
it's like rather than the ethics of the kind of postmodern ethic of particular identities, particularity as being the focus of ethics, the face, and we touched on this in the Eurocentrism episode, but like the ethic of postmodernism or of like multiculturalism tries to render ethics via particularity, where Žižek wants an ethic of universality, which is why he's wants an ethic beyond the face, beyond the particular.
Right.
Yeah. And this is, I think, this is a purely psychoanalytic understanding of the other, because what makes the other is not their positive humanness that's represented in their face, for example, but it's the inhuman element behind the face, the inhuman real, right? That is the very unassimilable, like the unsort of integratable aspect of the other is this definitive marker of the inhuman, which is interior to it as a fucking excess, man. This is the extimate goddamn relationship of the subject.
He says actually the other mentality, the postmodern tolerant mentality towards the other, actually in a sense tries to domesticate or gentrify the other, make the other the same, right? Žižek is trying to preserve, as we've been talking about, the question, I think you could say.
Yeah. And the movement from merely rendering this all too human is to incorporate, as he often does, Kant's notion of the inhuman, the non-human, and then into Hegel and psychoanalysis as part of the neighbor, like the monstrosity of the neighbor, the excessiveness of the neighbor. Like the neighbor isn't purely you, like out there, but like it's about that relationship you have between each other that is kind of unquantifiable, isn't particularly conditioned by any certain traits, but is always kind of like in the background. Like the inhuman quality to like not only yourself but to others. And that which is like the excessiveness about the interaction, and this is like I think generally what like we've been talking about with the symbolic order. The symbolic order is itself excessive. It's not the direct relationship of one can have of reality, but it's the overlay of reality.
It's castrated, right? The symbolic order itself is castrated, but it acts as though there's a disavowal, right? And so too is the neighbor, and so too is the subject. Is to what extent we actually psychotically admit our castration. And he brings up in the essay various figures that represent the non-neighborly, right? The person that exists beyond, who knows that there is no big other. It's the subject of Kafka's short story, also the Musliman in the concentration camps, the people who do not participate in this impossible relationship because they're not under the imaginary illusion for various reasons that relationship is possible. And so the very idea of the symbolic order is to obscure, although it emerges out of the castration, it obscures castration so that we can in fact fucking relate. Right?
Yeah, and it's and he also says that imagining that you can kind of communicate beyond that castration, or like that you can be, like, as we're saying, a cohesive identity, individual, other, is itself a form of kind of another ideological formation. It's an attempt to explain the world, to cohesively have a like kind of narrative about the world.
What's interesting is that remember the superego in the act was the episode that we did. I think it's a Patreon episode, but like the difference. Yeah, subscribe to our Patreon. The difference, what we decided was behind an act actually had a kind of evental status insofar as it basically broke with. It emerged. The conditions of its possibility emerged almost nonsensical within the current symbolic register. Mm-hmm. And I think that Žižek speaks of an ethical act in the same way, that the ethics has to be this kind of willingness to sacrifice what is most close and identifiable for a person. But in this way, ethics involves immediately a relationship with the other, with the neighbor. So you actually have to treat the neighbor in such a way, which is that you're going to ignore the positive and immediate contents while acting in accordance to a calculatable universal, right? Like a pretty like dangerous universal. I think it's violent. Ethics for Žižek is
violent because it doesn't violence in the sense of not needing or accommodating those particularities. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, basically, we have to ignore the face in front of us. Treat
and
the
violent
person as
in the
if they're
sense,
faceless.
I think violent in the same fashion as God of the Old Testament, of the Jewish Bible. The God of the God of justice. Sorry.
Let's just wait till it's over.
Coming out the door. I should probably answer that.
The neighbor rings.
The neighbor rings.
You're like, excuse me, can you shut the fuck up about neighbors? I can hear you.
Yeah.
Enjoy the music for a minute.
I mean, Žižek talks about he talks about just sort of like the contingent moment arises when you need to do the right thing, and you do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, and you yourself do not feel anything, you know, a certain kind of disinterestedness in response to that demand, right, that the other puts on us, right? This, because I think once we realize that there is no big other, or that our desire is just simply the desire of the other, then I think we can free ourselves up from, like, I think the concept of like fucking ethical personhood, you know, like an ethical action is not done by a certain person toward a certain person based on who they are, and who the person, you know what I mean? An ethical action is more ethical.
It's more ethical. It's like what he says about love, right? If you love someone for certain reasons, it's not really love. If you're doing an act, an ethical, if you're attempting to do an ethical act for a specific kind of person for a specific reason, as laudable as that is, it is not true justice, because this is another point that he makes. Maybe we don't want to go here though, but do you want to go here? Justice. That justice completely abstracts from the particularity of the situation. Justice is a universal law, a universal principle that abstracts away from these more minor acts, I suppose, minor ethics.
Yeah. And the mythology of justice is that it's blind.
Yeah.
The injunction is to love thy neighbor like thyself, but love is not blind. And so we have to, in order to be just, we have to ignore the inner truth of the other that we apparently see, right? That's present in its the other's presence to us. But to act justly, we have to act blindly, right? In a certain way, blind to the positive contents of the other in front of us, but in line with a universal. So we have to be kind of blind to the particularity,
You don't treat them as a
toy-
subject. Sorry, you don't treat them as a person. You treat them as a subject.
The subject.
Right. And he also, I mean,
Exactly.
I think it does connect because like he says like, as soon as you have particular reasons why you love someone, you don't love them. Like it's not about the particular qualities of them. It kind of like the love is the condition for loving those particularities.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And then to go back to, to get to that finishing point, Peter, like he says, in Judaism, the neighbor is not displayed to us through their face. It is his or her fundamental dimension of being a faceless monster, that we are neighbors with them. So like, can we in fact reduce our neighbor to pure fucking cogito subject to the subject? Can we cleanse the neighbor or the person to whom we are ethically, bound? Can we cleanse them of all the imaginary and symbolic lure of the inner wealth of who they are and what their story is and who they're from, and treat them ethically?
And yet still act ethically towards them, even
and
without
I think
those
this,
elements. Yeah.
It's exactly. So being blind to them and acting ethically. And I think this is why this is the imminent critique to like the politically correct sort of notion of tolerance, is because basically, can we exist without being offended? Can we be neighbors without being offended?
Yeah.
Because I think that I think knowing each other's stories is this kind of, as Žižek says, it's not about a certain proximity. It's about tolerant distance, right? Tolerance is merely just about setting up the right distance so you can tolerate the fucking other in their differences, right?
And in that scenario, you're still placing yourself as the central determining category, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. It's this, yeah, it's the same as the prohibition of certain parties not being able to speak of their identity while other parties are allowed to, right? It's that the prohibition actually functions as a kind of universal medium, right? By which we understand everyone else. And I think, so Žižek says, what if the ultimate function of the law is not to enable us not to forget the neighbor, to retain our proximity to the neighbor, but on the contrary, to keep the neighbor at a proper distance, to serve as a kind of protective wall against the monstrosity of the neighbor? In short, the temptation to be resisted here is the ethical gentrification of the neighbor. And I think that will allow us to talk about why the fuck Christianity is somehow Judaism in a dialectic. Probably not. Does it even lead to that?
I think that's a good place to end it. We don't necessarily even have to discuss that because, Jake, I think your point you just made is a very good like ending point, and we're running a little long anyway, or we're in danger of running long. Unless you really want to talk about it. I don't think it's required.
Okay, maybe we'll say cut.
So, fellas, I think that kind of ties it up. Anything else you want to add?
I can't think of anything. No, I can't wait to talk to you again. Fucking A.
Yeah, that was good. That was a good time.
Fucking A. Don't have me saying fucking A.
No,
I'm afraid you've already committed to saying it, Jake.
Yeah, twice, 3 times.
No. Maybe you're referring to object A. We can
once,
say that.
Twice, 3 times. A fucking A.
Fucking I like that. Okay.
Fucking
Žižek and so on. See you guys later.
Thank you.